Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is Andrea Montanino. I'm the director of the Global Business Economics Program at the Atlantic Council. A warm welcome to Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. In 2011, the Atlantic Council presented Madame Lagarde with one of its distinguished Global Citizen Awards, which are designed to spotlight the inspired leadership our complex world requires. And today, she's joining us as the sixth and final speaker in the Power of Transparency series, co-organized with Thomson Reuters. Featuring high-level speakers with diverse background and expertise, the series looked into the role of transparency in fighting corruption in financial system, inspiring global prosperity, strengthening national intelligence, and in preventing future financial crises. The key takeaway of the series for me is that while there is a great interest in making the world more transparent, there is also an even greater need to explore further areas, the areas where the world lacks transparency, and there are still many around. While at the same time, I think we have to continue to showcase the progress that has already been achieved. I look forward to hearing from Christine Lagarde about the power of transparency to increase economic resilience and the role of the IMF. As a former executive director at the fund, it's a personal pleasure and a great honor for me to be welcoming you here at the Council. As a personal note, I always appreciated your transparent approach, providing full disclosure to the board about program negotiation and other sensitive issues. And I also noted the increasing attention of the institution as such to provide additional information to the public in order to allow a more informed judgment. Think, for instance, I'll give just an example that I remember well, the debt sustainability analysis, which is extremely relevant nowadays to make investment decisions. I would also welcome Ms. Mona Vernon, the Vice President of Innovation Labs at Thomson Reuters, for her and ultimately for the company to succeed. Transparency across the enterprise, among the networks she manages, as well as transparency in facts and data are very important. Before giving the floor to you, Ms. Vernon, I want to give a special thank you to Kate Frederick from Thomson Reuters for her tireless efforts and support through the series, and Marie Kasper from my team, who made this series an unexpected success. Let me finally recall that the event is on the record, and you can tweet using the hashtag #PowerOfTransparency altogether. So, Ms. Vernon, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea, for this very kind remark. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. It's great to be here at the Atlantic Council for the sixth and final installment of the Power of Transparency series. I'd like to take a moment to thank Fred Camp and the Atlantic Council for their partnership and leadership in this effort. And a very special thanks to Andrea Montanino and Mary Kasperek for the tireless work in making this joint effort a great success. We are honored today to welcome the Managing Director of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, for a discussion on the power of transparency to increase economic resilience. The IMF's primary purpose is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, and transparency plays a critical role, increasingly part of that responsibility. Transparency is also at the core of everything we do at Thomson Reuters, and the reason we are pleased to co-sponsor this series with the Atlantic Council. Whether it's combating illicit finance and money laundering, bringing transparency to the complex world of global tax, delivering accurate and actionable information to financial market, and providing a transparent land management systems to developing countries, our products and services help foster a more transparent, connected, and empowered world. As a global solution provider in areas such as supply chain risk, global trade management, and economic development, Thomson Reuters is on the forefront using technology and information to increase transparencies in markets, regulatory frameworks, development programs, and trade, to just name a few. We recognize that transparency is not a static notion. We must be vigilant in bringing increased transparency to complex challenges we face today and we may face in the future. The IMF has taken on this task in many ways, but multilateral organizations and governments can't do this alone. The private sector has an important role here as well. We are pleased to be on the front lines of this effort through Thomson Reuters Labs. Through our labs, we are exploring innovative, data-driven solutions in collaboration with some of the world's brightest and smartest minds in global innovation ecosystems, in startup communities, universities, increasing transparency and unraveling complexity. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge our moderator, Axel Trelfall, Reuters editor-at-large. With over 20 years of experience in text and television journalism in both London and New York, Axel represents Reuters and Thomson Reuters at both external and internal events as editor-at-large. Prior to this role, Axel was the lead European anchor for Reuters, specializing in European politics and economics. Before that, he was an anchor at CNBC in London, and between its stints as a reporter and editor for the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg. Before we get this discussion started, I'm honored to introduce our distinguished guest. Christine Lagarde joined the French government in June 2005 as Minister for Foreign Trade. As a brief stint as a Minister for Agriculture and Fisheries in June 2007, she became the first woman to hold the post of Finance and Economy, Minister of a G7 country. From July to December 2008, she also chaired the ECOFIN Council, which brings together economics and finance ministers of the European Union and help foster international policies related to supervision, regulation, and strengthening global economic governance. As chairman of the G20, when France took over its presidency for the year 2011, she set in motion a wide-ranging work agenda on the reform of the international monetary system. On July 5, 2011, Christine Lagarde became the 11th managing director of the IMF and the first woman to hold that position. On February 19, 2016, the IMF Executive Board selected her to serve as IMF managing director for a second 5-year term starting on July 5, 2016. Christine Lagarde was also named officer in the Légion d'honneur in April 2012. Please join me in welcoming Christine Lagarde.
Well, thank you very much, Mona, for this kind introduction, and thank you, Fred, and you, Andrea, for organizing, sponsoring such an important cycle of discussions on the concept of transparency. I see many friendly faces around here, and I'm delighted to be back with the Atlantic Council. I'm not in the laundry business, but I'm going to start with 2 quotes, one of which is going to sound ambiguous to you. Sun is the best disinfectant of all. That's for the laundry part. But Stendhal, a very famous 18th century writer, Le Rouge et le Noir, that was him, wrote in that particular novel, actually, that he wouldn't like to live in a country where there would be no shade. So it's in between that sun, the virtues of which are closely related to transparency and how much light you shed on transactions, and the comfort of a little bit of shadow that transparency has to navigate. We are a little bit far away from the IMF, I know, but there is a connection. As some of you probably know, the IMF's mission and job, which was set in 1944, when the institution was formed right after, or actually even before the Second World War was finished, is to promote economic and financial stability. And that is a very precious public good, because it allows the economies to grow, and it allows probably an easier job at sharing the pie between the economic players. That is all citizens, in whichever capacity they are. Now, we do not create that public good. We contribute to it. Those who create the public good of economic and financial stability and eventually prosperity are the member states of the IMF, 189 of them. And they do so using all sorts of tools, but I contend that they do so also by disclosing data, policies, information, statistics in a transparent manner. By sharing this information with other policymakers around the world, with other multilateral institutions, by working together, and not just in times of crisis. I have my memories of the G20 very, very engaged and active meetings, but also in regular time. And our members do all this with our help, because they know that what happens to their economy, they know that what happens to other economies is going to matter to each and every one of them because of the very strong interconnectedness that there is between those economies. Volans nolans. That's the way supply chains are organized. That's the way companies have invested around the world. And that's the way economies actually interact with each other, as we have amply demonstrated in many of what we call our spillover studies of the impact of one set of policies over another countries or group of countries. And the IMF work is actually based on that transparency. And we couldn't do our work if it wasn't for that transparency, because it all starts with the data. It all starts with the numbers. It all starts with the disclosure of information and the sharing of that information. Now, we have many, many different roles. I would mention 4 of them. The first one we play is that of the trusted advisor. Typically, on an annual basis for most countries, a little less often for the very small countries, we conduct surveillance and give policy advice under what is called the Article 4. For those of you who are familiar with the IMF, that's the work that we do on a regular basis. We go under the skin of an economy, we engage in a dialogue, and we make our recommendations based on the actual data, numbers, and information that are validated under our codes and standards. The second role we play is that of a global watchdog, and that requires that we raise flags and encourage information sharing and collaboration. The third role we play is that of a fitness coach, if you will, because we provide technical assistance, training, and in many countries, particularly the emerging market economies and the low-income countries, we help with their capacity building and development. And finally, we are also firefighters. When the situation is very dire, when there is no one around to actually provide financing, we provide the financial assistance in times of need so that economies can get back on their feet and provide better prospects for their citizens. It's not the IMF money, it's the international community money that we actually lend. And in consideration for that international community financing provided through our services and intermediaries, we expect the countries to actually sort out their public finance and deal with the issues that have led them to ask the international community to lend to it. So transparency actually allows us to wear all these different hats for the benefit of our global membership. And for most of us, the benefits of transparency have been obvious in some ways. I think you would agree that much has been achieved over the past decades, but we have also tried to quantify the benefits of transparency, because as one of the first deputy managing directors of the IMF once said, Stan Fisher, and I'm quoting him because it was quite premonition on his part, he said, "Nothing would help improve standards more than if countries that met higher standards were rewarded with lower borrowing costs, acknowledging the value of incentives, as always. Well, voila. No, I promise I'm not going to switch into French. We actually tried to dig into that. And some of our IMF researchers went into that to see whether greater data transparency had had an impact on the borrowing cost of countries. And based on their study, which covers a whole span of countries that have gone through the various stages of transparency of data and communication, it shows, the research will be published in a couple of months, it's almost done now, but it shows that the practice of the ultimate transparency for the emerging market economies in particular has led to a 15% reduction in their spread of their sovereign bonds within 3 months after the improvements of transparency has actually been acknowledged by the markets. So there is a tangible outcome from the effort undertaken by those emerging market economies to actually be more transparent and disclose the data that they have. Now, of course, that is, the net benefit for countries. But what is good for the membership is also good for the IMF and for our mission. And it allows us to better contribute to the public debate. It allows us to actually offer the work that we do with the consent of our members. Most of the 189 members actually now volunteer to have their Article 4 report be published on a regular basis and made available to any public scrutiny. And it helps the analysts, the observers, the academics to actually go deep into their understanding of countries, but also scrutinize and investigate the work that we do. And we don't mind that. We are often criticized. And that's the price that we have to pay for accountability. It's not pleasant. Transparency is not pleasant. And that's where I come back to Stendhal. I wouldn't want to live in a country where there is no shade. Well, price of no shade, which is the reverse of transparency, is that you are criticized because you are accountable. Now, in pursuing that transparency, and we've done that repeatedly over the last few years, requires that we also engage with a broader audience. And under the leadership of our head of communication, Jerry Rice, who is here, we have decided to go out, reach out, and actually be accountable to members of parliament, to business owners, to students, to women's association, that's my personal cause, to policy experts, to policy non-experts, to NGOs, to people interested. And we will continue to do that. And I think that this whole debate that we're having at the moment about the experts and the value of those experts actually must be addressed with transparency, with proper communication, and with less jargonic discourse that can actually engage much better. So this is really all I wanted to say as quick opening remarks before we go into the discussion that I'm sure will be far more interesting than my opening remarks. But don't forget, sun is the best disinfectant, which means that light and transparency can actually be extremely productive when it comes to removing a few of those funny practices and dubious financing.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Madame Lagarde, for those words. And thank you for that little bit of news, the 15%, which I'm sure we'll delve into a little bit in a while. I'm delighted to be back at the Atlantic Council, honored to be hosting this final conversation in the series. Now, with my news hat on, there is an awful lot for us to talk about. And of course, our guest is uniquely positioned to talk about a lot of that. Luckily, I think our theme today will allow us to address a number of these issues. So we will get to that stuff, whether it's in this conversation or in the question and answer session that I'll come to at the end. But I do want to make the chunk of this discussion on the stage that I'm going to have now with the Managing Director about this theme today of transparency, the way it's being promoted in member countries, and indeed the way and what is being done within the fund itself on the issue of transparency. So thank you very much again for your words. I'm interested, Madame Lagarde, to explore a little bit the delicate balance between the roles that you play. And you talked about a few of them. Trusted advisor and global watchdog are two of those. How do you find that balance? I imagine there's a tension there a lot of the time. How do you find the balance, and what dictates which way you go?
Yes, there is a tension between the two, because typically the trusted advisor relationship relies on a degree of confidentiality and the ability to argue sometimes against the political rationale behind such or such policy. And that part of the debate does not necessarily have to be mainstream discussion.
Right.
Right? And that's actually one of the conditions for it to be efficient and lead to possible changes of policies. I'll give you an example, which is actually available on our website, because if you reconcile things, you can actually put one and one together. I'll give you the example of Sweden. Sweden, we recently conducted an Article 4, which is totally disclosed and available to those who are interested in Sweden and the Swedish economy, which is doing pretty well. But we found out that household mortgage was going seriously up and could actually have consequences on the solidity of the Swedish banks. And I'm not here saying that the Swedish banks are not solid, that they're fine. But it could have ramifications, okay? And what's interesting is that Swedish banks are not just located in Sweden. They are also invested, and they have branched out, and they have subsidiaries in other countries in the Nordic part of Europe. So it's a matter that becomes suddenly not just Swedish or Sweden-specific,
right,
but that is of interest to Denmark, to Norway, to a few other countries in the vicinity. So we are the trusted advisor when we say to the finance minister of Sweden or the prime minister, you have to look at this household mortgage issue, because that is something that could be a bit of a threat to your economy. But we have to be the watchdog when we say to all the Nordic countries, ramification, possible spillover effects onto your respective economies as a result of the Swedish banks not being that powerful.
And I imagine it's a very fine line sometimes. And I imagine that is what people still have an issue with. What dictates it? What's the rule of thumb? Who makes the decision? Who decides, right, we are not going to share this information? And who decides, actually, it's in the public good to know it?
You know, we share most of it, and most of it is in the public domain. The staff report that is done at the end of these, I don't call them Article 4 for the purpose of this meeting, I will call them annual audit. So you have a mission from the IMF that will visit the 189 countries, and they will conduct their mission by talking to the authorities, by talking to the unions, by talking to the business associations, by talking to NGOs, and so on and so forth. They conclude that with a staff report, and that is available. So a lot of the information, a lot of the concerns, a lot of the recommendations are actually available in the report that is published with the consent of that country. Now, the individual discussions that the mission chief and his team has with the central bank governor or the finance minister, this is something that remains in the communication
Yeah.
and which
Yeah.
doesn't go onto any site or any publications of any source. And that fine line is really actually determined by the principle of efficiency.
Is it fair, Madame Lagarde, to say that, you know, despite all the progress that has been made, in times of stress or in times of crisis, the instinctive default position at an organization like the IMF is to withdraw and be a little bit more secretive?
No.
No?
No. You know, I think the institution has actually learned its lessons. And the determination to publish as much as possible with consent of the membership, because it's not, you know, for us eventually to decide, but with consent of the members and with a lot of peer pressure between them. Because when you have, say, 169 deciding to publish their report, the other 20 are really sort of in a hot spot when they say, no publication. As a result of that, most of them now publish. But this was determined at the time of the Asian crisis. Most of what the IMF was doing in the early 80s was pretty secretive.
Yeah.
Not disclosed, discussed behind closed doors amongst men, essentially. And the Asian financial crisis really brought to the fore the fact that a lot of the information should have been communicated, and that would have been helpful in order to prevent and anticipate. So I think as a result of that, having learned that lesson, you know, run forward, then everything pretty much is public now.
That's a pretty strong message, I think,
and a lot
from
of it is free as well, by the way. That's something that we've determined a couple of years ago. There used to be statistic data, a lot of compilation of very valuable information that was only accessible if you paid the fees. This is no longer the case either. It's free.
How big a part of the discussion, I'll move on from this in a second, but how big a part of the discussion is the likely reaction in the marketplace, in the market? The extent to which any sort of risk can impact the market.
Now, of course, we have policies. And it's one of the exceptions where a country, or the country, the authorities represented by executive directors, as Andrea was, or as I can see a few of former colleagues in the room, they can actually say, oops, market sensitive, please delete that particular piece of data or information from the report. The policy is extremely detailed, specific, and only allows for that information to be removed if it is really documented and determined that it is going to actually swing markets, and it is of a confidential nature that would actually harm, in a detrimental way, the fairness and openness and transparency.
And then, on the other hand, if you are not, if your communication or lack of communication to the market means the market becomes upset, does that then dictate that you need to be more open in your communication? And I will mention the first news piece here, and that is the way the market is reacting to a lack of information surrounding the Greek situation. And the IMF's participation in that.
We are not market-driven in the decisions that we make or the analysis that we conduct. We have to pay attention to markets. We have a department within the IMF, which is market and monetary policies, which obviously keeps a very close eye on development. But our determination, our analysis are not market-driven. Separately, I would contend that when we publish a report with the consent of the country, as was the case with Greece yesterday, for instance, we do contribute to transparency. We do contribute to a better information of all those interested. Now, people can argue with the findings. People can disagree with our conclusions. But we go in full independence, with a clear determination to be both the trusted advisor, but the ruthless truth teller, as Lord Maynard Keynes would have said. So we're not sugarcoating. And
all right. I'll leave that. No doubt we will come back to that issue. I saw on your website the fiscal transparency page, which I think has been up for what, a year or two now. Something along those
possibly
lines.
about,
What drove that? What drove that sort of information and the need or the desire for the IMF to have that on your website?
I think it's the determination with the membership and with the Fiscal Affairs Department that publishing this is important, focusing on the fiscal transparency rules, codes, and providing a special service to some of those countries that volunteer for the program is actually beneficial. So it's one of the services that is available and which has led countries to actually change a few things about the way in which they report. The UK has been one. Ireland has been also changing the way in which they deal with public-private partnership in how they report those public spending.
Is there, and you know, I've heard this mentioned, and it's not me, the cynic, here saying this, but is there a sense of a lick of paint here? Appearances matter, and we've got this up on our site. We need to give the impression this is extremely important to us.
It's not an impression. What certainly has changed over the course, since I started my mission as head of the IMF, what has certainly changed is the scope, volume, and depth of information that is available, as well as the channels of disseminations. That has been a striking feature of the way in which we deliver our work. I'm sorry to say, but we used not to tweet. Okay, but we started about 2 years ago.
You've opened that door now, yeah?
No. 2 years ago, okay, and when we started using Facebook, Twitter, WeChat, Weibo, and so on and so forth, based on the culture of the IMF, it was questionable whether it was appropriate to actually communicate along those lines. I think it's very necessary that we do, and that all the good work that is done that contributes to transparency is actually made available. I mean, we live in a society where clearly there is this appetite for information, data, and we cannot just hide the good work that we do. We have to share it.
Moving now to
people don't always like it.
No.
Let's face it.
Right. Moving away from internal and now more to the way you promote transparency externally, you have these FTEs, the fiscal transparency evaluations. Are these ever conducted privately as a condition of IMF assistance?
No, the FTE, the fiscal transparency evaluations are voluntary. This is not something that we can impose upon a country as part of the normal surveillance, the trusted advisor mission that I referred to earlier. We could imagine doing it or doing something equivalent when we are the firefighter, when we provide a financing program. And we could actually say, because we need to better understand and because we have specific remedies to offer, we really insist on you going through the fiscal transparency evaluation. We haven't done that for the moment. It's been done on a purely voluntary basis.
Yeah, and I believe the IMF website has published 15 reports, including the UK.
Yeah.
I wonder if others have been conducted that haven't been made available publicly yet.
Probably because some are underway at the moment, and they will only be made public once they're completed. I'd have to double check that, but I'm sure it is the case.
What more to the 15% number that you talked about, and the sorts of benefits that come out of, and just very quickly checking that 15% number, is that country by country, or is it's not a rounded general number?
I haven't read the research, and I actually questioned this morning to make sure that I could actually volunteer that number. But it's a number that cuts across those emerging market economies that are under review. Yeah.
And what sort of message do you think that sends governments? When the sort of feedback you get from governments in emerging markets in particular, what sort of message do you get from them?
I don't think that we've received a thank you letter for that. But my suspicion is that, 15% lower borrowing cost is not insignificant for a sovereign. And if we are going to communicate on that, because I think it should encourage some of the countries to actually go even further and deeper in their transparency.
And you really think
efforts.
this is a trend now, not just a blip?
I think it is, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
I would hope so.
Okay.
I would hope so.
All right. Back to the sort of. In fact, I want to talk a little bit about something Mona mentioned, and you mentioned it as well, and that is all the players involved and the importance of the private sector, the importance of the private sector as a force for good. But of course, there is a lot of concern about the private sector and corruption in the private sector, and I know you've talked about this in the past as well.
Can I stop you just for a second?
Yeah.
I think corruption is not just a one-way street. It's not just the private sector. It takes two to corrupt. One that gives, one that receives. So I think it's an issue that needs to be thoroughly, deeply investigated, pursued at all levels, public and private. We only operate at the public level.
But of course you are working closely with the private sector as well. You need that participation. They need to sit at this table if we're going to move forward in a positive fashion, right?
We work with public authorities, and when we conduct an anti-money laundering, and much more recently, and in a very, very broad way now, the CFT, the counter-financing of terrorism, which is, they're part of the same story, let's face it. We operate with public authorities, with policymakers, and we help them trace the flow of illicit financing. We help them identify the transactions. We help them with as much technical assistance as we can. But we don't work with the private sector. That's where we provide our assistance.
Sure. I'm jumping around a little bit, but I want to come back to this issue of, and it's mentioned often by the IMF, this issue of even-handedness when you deal with countries. To what extent is the IMF getting to grips with that and communicating about how it deals differently with different countries and fairly with different countries?
I think we have to deal differently with different countries. And if there is anything that I have learned myself as a former finance minister for France from the financial crisis and how we went about stimulating on a global basis by an increase of 2% of GDP, is that we should have been and we could have been a lot more country specific. And that would have been probably a more reasonable option. So I think anything we do, whether it's surveillance, whether it's program, whether it's technical assistance, has to be country specific. I'm just back from Uganda and the Central African Republic. You don't provide technical assistance in those countries in the same way as you provide technical assistance to Switzerland or Italy, for that matter. It's different. So we absolutely, if we want to do our job, we have to be country specific. Now, where we have to be very careful, and that's one of the principles of operation of the IMF, is that we have to be even-handed. And we cannot, simply because a country is either a small country or because it's a big country, favor one or be more complacent or less demanding with one or the other. So it's a very subtle dosage, if you will, of being country-specific, tailored to the fundamentals and specificities of the economy, the demographics, the culture, the surrounding and the security of that country, and being even-handed. We have instituted in the institution a mechanism by which the executive board members who represent the entire membership can actually raise the lack of even-handedness if they see it. And where that's...
Which they do, right?
Which they do occasionally, yes. And then that is investigated, that is checked, verified, and if there is a treatment on a particular issue that has not been even-handed, then we need to rectify it.
But you are happy with where you stand on this now and the way it's communicated,
Look,
despite the criticism?
Perfection is not of this world. And I think we need to constantly work and improve on those issues, whether it's transparency, whether it's even-handedness, whether it's being the ruthless truth teller, as I said earlier. We constantly have to watch and improve. And by the way, there's you know, when I'm a funny animal because I spent most of my life in the private sector. And then I became a finance minister. But when I joined the IMF, I was bemused by the level of internal auditing, internal evaluation, both conducted within the institution, but conducted also by sort of separate bodies that were totally independent in order to constantly evaluate and publish the report.
Right. Was that a box-ticking exercise? Why were you why were you bemused by that?
Because I don't know many institutions that have that level of scrutiny, that level of accountability, and that sort of open door policy to any criticism that you care to raise or issue.
And yet the perception continues to be, or veer occasionally to the critical, despite all of this.
Because, as I said, perfection is not of this world, and we have to constantly be able to improve. And to better improve, you have to open your chest, take your shirt off, and tell people to throw arrows at you. That's what we do. And if there are things that we do wrongly, then we should fix it.
What I'm going to come to some audience questions shortly, but what more will we see from the IMF in this area of opening up, this area of Christine Lagarde standing up and talking about transparency and the way it evolves at the fund?
I hope that we do more in relation to corruption, because it leads to very risky and dangerous activities. When we do we've conducted anti-money laundering and counter terrorism financing in 140 countries now. And there's a big academic debate as to whether that is useful, not useful. Does it contribute to reducing the risks? I think we need to just work on that more and more and more. You know, what helps terrorism? What helps the obscure activities that are conducted behind screens? It's money. So you have to follow the money. You have to know where it's coming from, where it's going, and how. And I think this is based on the principles of good governance. So we will be working on these issues of governance, on whether or not we can incorporate those governance principles into the annual audit that we conduct under this Article 4. You know, we have seen...
And will we see that happen?
I would hope so.
Yeah.
It's, you know, it's at the end of the day, it's the decision of the board as to whether or not we should go further into that, unless these governance issues are so macro-critical that it either prevents us from operating efficiently or it impedes the mission altogether. I'll give you a couple of examples. Ukraine is a good example where, because of corruption, which had endemic proportions, we suggested to the authorities, and luckily they accepted, that anti-corruption measures, anti-corruption agencies, change of the public procurement rules, sorting out a particular company that was the nest of a lot of illicit flows, as well as reforming the judicial systems, were part and parcel of the economic recovery that was desired. The authorities agreed, and we just need to keep at it. And that's one of the examples of where, you know, our entry into this anti-corruption activity is, I hope, going to be more prevalent in the future.
You mentioned the board, so it's a good opportunity to ask this question, which I know you've been asked many times, and no doubt have a pretty stock response for, but the minutes aren't published. Well, they're published every 5 years. Is
3 years.
It's 3 years,
Yeah,
is it?
yeah. The statute of limitation is 3 years.
Okay,
Anything
all
that
right.
is, older than 3 years of age, you can have access.
And us journalists throw at you. The ECB publishes it. The Fed publishes it. In the interest of transparency, is that going to change? I mean,
I'd have to ask the board.
No, shouldn't it change? Is my question.
I think it's going to be a board decision. It's not going to be the chairman's ultimate and single decision.
Okay.
I've evaded your response.
Watch this space, right? Back to where I started, and I'm going to get a little bit more specific, but the context in which we're operating, and I'm pretty sure in Davos I heard you talk about the possible race to the bottom on taxes, on regulation, on trade, and that being a potential black swan. That context, the context here in the US, anti-globalization, the rise of populism, how hard is it, or how much harder is it to push this message that you're pushing today in that context?
I think that what is really important is to find amongst our membership, because I have to go back to my institution, the 189 countries that we have to serve. What's critically important is to find the common denominator between them. And I really think that financial stability, sustainable and inclusive growth, creation of jobs, particularly for young people around the world, have to be the three cornerstones of what bring countries together. And while there can be criticism about this, that, or the other, I think around those three pillars, I don't see how we could disagree. Because I don't know any policymakers around the world, whether it's in the low-income countries, the emerging markets, or the advanced economies, be that in this country or across the Atlantic. I can't think of any policymakers saying, I want more unemployment, I want less growth, and I want more financial instability. This is just, or that person is yet to be born. So I think what we need to do, because our mission as dictated by our founding fathers back in 1944, was to procure the financial and economic stability. So we have to focus on that and be as ruthless truth teller as we can, relying on the solidity of the work done by economists and experts from around the world, all gathered in this institution that serves public good, to say, okay, well, trade has worked so far and in so many corners of the world, but it has not worked for all. And measures need to be taken in order to address this inclusive growth issue. Or financing is nicely spreading and helping entrepreneurs around the world, but not women.
Right.
And particularly in low-income countries. These are the kinds of things that we have to flag, and we have to explain why that is.
And have to adapt to as well, right? How
we have to propose the policies that will remedy those issues.
That will remedy the issues. Okay, it's not a matter of adapting to this new paradigm, this new.
I've been saying since certainly in Davos 2013. I said, pay attention to excessive inequalities. It is going to come back to haunt you, and it will hurt. That's what we are seeing now, and we need to deal with it. Shutting down trade or reducing the activity is not going to address this issue. So we need to find the right ways to address issues that are of common interest to the membership.
Let me ask my question, if I may, in a slightly more direct way. What does it do to your push for transparency when your largest shareholder acts in a way that many say flies in the face of transparency, flies in the face of ethical behavior?
We have to assess policies. We have to look at bills that are passed and evaluate the impact that they can have. And we will do that. but we're not going to opine on sort of movements, slogans, views that are reported by one or the other. I think we need to be very cautious with that. We're not being pompous or full of vanity, but we need to operate in a reliable, scientific way in order to shed light on the consequences of decisions made, not decisions that are talked about.
Right, I'm going to open it up to our audience, who I know have got some questions for you, and
Sure.
I'll sort of weave this stuff in. Yeah, I'll take 3 at a time, because I know there are a lot of questions. So gentleman there, gentleman here, and gentleman there.
You'll have a woman as well.
I was looking for a woman, yeah. I was looking for a woman. I'm sorry, there's going to be 3 women next.
Sorry for being
Go
male.
ahead. Go ahead. Tell us who you are, and then ask your question.
Ilya Ponomarev. I'm coming from one of the least transparent areas of the world, from Russia and Ukraine. I'd like to thank you very much for what IMF is doing for Ukraine right now to stabilize the country. And I think it's not right now only a matter of economic stability, it's a matter of geopolitical security, which is extremely important. But my question is, I saw the influence of IMF in Russia in 90s. And right now, a lot of what Vladimir Putin is doing is blaming IMF for the way my country has gone. What are the lessons learned in Ukraine when you are doing your assistance and reforms in Ukraine to avoid what was done in Russia and to push the country towards the West, towards the civilized community, and not to be in their nutshell?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, gentleman right here.
O.J. Aberdeen, member of the Atlantic Council Board.
Do you want to grab that mic? Thanks.
As a trusted advisor to member states and as someone who's promoting transparency, when your staff visits a country that's known for being highly corrupt, what do you tell these officials? Secondly, do you think corruption is a form of private taxation?
Thank you. And right behind you, if you could hand that back there. Thanks.
Thank you, Alex. Madam Lagarde, my name is Matthew Murray, and up until a couple of weeks ago, I worked for the Obama administration as a senior official on, among other issues, diplomacy towards Ukraine, where I would argue we had an excellent track record of cooperation with the IMF, and you were very much at the center of the leadership in rendering transparency part of the diplomacy towards that country. So I'd like to ask you to comment a little bit further, given the high stakes and the epic struggle that we face over rules-based trade in Ukraine, on whether you see the Ukrainian leadership taking ownership of the transparency agenda, whether you see the reforms in Ukraine, such as they are today, beginning to pay for themselves soon, and whether, therefore, you think the IMF will be able to, at some point, begin to disengage and let the private sector take over where you leave off. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I hope I did not misunderstand your question on Ukraine and who was blaming whom. But I have to say that we were involved in Russia, as you know, and when I first visited Russia as managing director of the IMF, I was quite pleasantly surprised to hear then President Medvedev actually thank the IMF for the role that we played in helping his country at the time that you mentioned in the 90s. So there was clearly an acknowledgement of the role that we played. He did say to me it was not pleasant, and it's never particularly pleasant. I've had the same story told in some of the Asian countries that we did help. But in the case of Russia, I had gratitude expressed by the then president. In terms of what we do in Ukraine, I believe that no country, however big it is, would have any interest in having at its border an economy that is not functioning, that is in economic misery. So I would hope that at some stage, the work that we are doing and that we have done in relation to Ukraine is recognized for what it is, which is to try to help the country get back on its feet, be able to walk on its legs, as I often say in relation to another country, which I'm sure I will get a question about, and be able to do so with less corruption, respect for the rule of law, and economic activity being prosperous and not captured. So what do we say to countries that where we know that corruption is just there? Luckily, we have, in a way, third-party validators. When various institutions publish rankings or assess the degree of transparency, of corruption, of what I would call, funny business going on, we can rely on that to actually put the question on the table. Do we do enough of that? In my view, probably not. And that's the whole point of this governance review that is being conducted at the moment and which will give rise to proposals that will be submitted to the board. I would like us to do a little bit more. It's relatively easy when we have a program, because then we have traction. It's, tit for tat. Financing comes, but you really have to fix this, sort that out. If it's of a macro-critical dimension, then clearly we are legitimate in saying, your public procurement system is completely rotten. You need to fix it. And that's part of the prior actions that you need to take. Or you've got all these funny special purpose vehicles outside your budget. That needs to go. And you need to reintegrate all of that in the budget so that we can understand exactly what is going on. And when you say that your deficit is only 8%, we want to know what's in those SPVs as well. Or your court decisions are only coming 15 years or 20 years after the matter has been raised. That's an issue which needs to be addressed as well. Or your tax cases are never completed, and tax is not paid for years and years and years until it is eventually settled. Those are areas where it's clearly of a fiscal nature. It's clearly macro-critical, and when we are in a program relationship, then we have traction, and we can request that that be addressed. You asked me whether it was private taxation, and I think that's an interesting proposition, because it is clearly revenue, which at least portion of should be public revenue. The assessment, which is not ours, it's been published, and it's generally a sort of conventional wisdom, that bribes only amount for about $2 trillion. That's 2% of global GDP. It's huge. And it's private withholdings, some of which should actually find its way into public revenue. Ownership, I would hope so. Ownership of the very deep reforms that were decided. I think it's a constant work that needs to be done in partnership. I'll give you an example, and you know that as much as I do. It's all very well saying that we are setting up an anti-corruption agency. But if the members of that agency are all appointed by the same group of people, who are all holding hands and diverting assets, it doesn't work. It works on paper. The agency has been set up, yes, but so what? So if those agencies are staffed with people who are recommended independently, and in the case of Ukraine, we have worked extensively with NGOs, civil society, to have proposals coming out. Is it perfect? Probably not. But it's certainly a step in the right direction in order to have something that is more reliable than, the president, the prime minister, and the head of parliament appointing their respective friends. Not that their friends would not be good, but in terms of governance, it just didn't pass mustard. I take a little bit of comfort from the fact that we are heading towards the next review of the Ukraine program. And I don't think that in the history of the relationship between the IMF and Ukraine, we have gone so far into the life of a program. There have been many programs in the past. Most of them have been aborted after 1 or 2 reviews. We are now into the, is it the 4th review? I think it's the 4th review. So, yeah, I'm a little bit more confident.
Apparently. Okay.
3rd. Sorry, 3rd.
Good. Lady there, lady behind you, and lady in the front row here. So.
Wow.
I said I'd do it.
Madam, thank you so very much for being here today. I'm Elaine Soreo. I'm the Associate Rector of Wisconsin International Ukraine University, WIUU, a private university in Kiev, Ukraine. And indeed, Ukraine has been the topic, it seems to be, of your conversation today. Your points about sunlight and what IMF can do and is trying to do more, particularly in the areas of communication about transparency. Would you be able to see, let's say, for the public interests in Ukraine for the people of Ukraine, a program, indeed maybe even a conference, in which these kinds of topics are presented for public consumption, and at the same time, it could also be possibly even televised. Yesterday, I was here at Atlantic Council. There was an excellent presentation of the rollout of Current Time TV, which is going to be addressing a whole host of topics. Do you see this as a role for IMF to take forward, particularly in Ukraine at this time?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, lady behind you. Yeah.
Madame Lagarde, first of all, thank you for being a role model for young professionals. My name is Elizabeth Rojas. I work for the Nokia Corporation here in Washington, directing all of government relations in the Americas. My question is, data-driven decision-making and transparency. You need technology to get that data and to evangelize the data. How can the IMF, the World Bank, and all of the multilateral institutions work more efficiently with technology companies to really have the best tools to gather that data? Mm-hmm. Because in my experience, it's very, very tricky to navigate these big organizations and to bring real pragmatic solutions and for yourselves to gather that data.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, right here.
Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chairman. Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chairman of the Atlantic Council. Today, Greece has criticized the IMF, questioned some of the reports on the issue of transparency. How are you responding to what Greece is alleging?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Communication issue on Ukraine. I'll tell you what I commit here we will do. When the program is over, I know my team is getting terribly edgy now. Once the program is over, as we have done in Latvia, as we have done in Ireland, as we have done in Portugal, if I recall, we will do a public conference in Ukraine to have a public debate attended by members of the Ukrainian academic world, economists from other countries, hopefully, and some of the IMF leaders who have worked so hard on that program, so that we can draw the lessons and learn from the process and acknowledge what has been achieved, and maybe criticize what should have been achieved and has not been achieved. But that's what I would commit. You see, we need to be. It's funny because we are this trusted advisor, we are this watchdog, we are the firefighter, and we are the fitness coach. But we have to let the authorities take ownership. If we don't let the policymakers, the authorities, the governments take full ownership and decide that it's theirs and it's going to be for the benefit of their people, their country, it is not going to work. I've seen it time and again. When there is no ownership, there is no positive outcome at the end of the day. So that's where I think our communication can play out well. And of course, in the process of the program, we are very open, and we actually publish the review, and we are totally transparent on that front. Now, on the use of technology, very well put. I think we've already gone a long way from those sort of stacks of papers and Excel documents to being far more technology-based. But it's not enough, and we have to just constantly be at it. So for that reason, I'll give you two examples of what we do internally, what we do externally. Internally, we have decided that we would actually entrust the youngest generation of our economists to take charge in a way. And we are setting up, as I was telling you earlier on, a lab where they will have the ability to innovate, to fail, to start again, to make bold proposals, to think outside the box. And it's a little bit unusual in the natural culture of the IMF to do something like that. But I'm personally committed to that experiment, and I will encourage them to do that. I think in the field of technologies, they are going to be helpful and focused. That's internal. Externally, I'll give you the example of something that we did about a month ago in Cameroon. Cameroon was interested in beefing up and improving its taxation system and the whole sort of public finance management. So we helped them build a hackathon. Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah. Hackathon. That brought together from all corners of Africa and beyond experts who suggested ideas. And there were 1,000 flowers blooming, of which some were selected as the best recipes for improvement of domestic revenue mobilization in Cameroon. Now, I very much hope, because this is not just data-driven, not just policy dictated, but it's also technology supported. I very much hope that that particular experiment that we conducted with Cameroon can be leveraged and can be made, of use to many other countries that are desperately in need of revenue mobilization. Yes, we did publish yesterday, Adrienne, the report, two reports actually on Greece. One which is the Article 4, so the regular audit of the Greek economy, which we hadn't done for quite a few years because of the programs that we had with Greece. And we also conducted something that is called the ex post evaluation, which reviewed the program that was started in 2012. And we tried in those reports, one of which is the in-depth analysis by our experts of the current state of the economy, the other one being a review of the previous program. We tried in full honesty to be those ruthless truth teller. And yes, we are criticized occasionally, and I'm sure that the Greek authorities didn't like some of the things that we said. But we also acknowledged in that Article 4 report the massive effort undertaken from the fiscal point of view by the Greek population and the huge sacrifices that were made. We also acknowledged that some reforms were conducted. But what is generally picked up by those who do not like all of it is the fact that we also said that some reforms were still to come, were not completed, had not yet delivered the benefits that were expected in order to unleash the forces of the Greek economy. And I think that both on the income tax reform, where too few people, generally the wage earners, are bearing the burden of taxation, and on the pension scheme, where clearly there has to be a double layer, one of social protection for the less privileged people, and a pension system that actually holds sustainability. Reforms are absolutely needed. And somebody can ask me the questions 3 times over. I will still say the same thing.
Okay. Look, we're running out of time. We've got time for 3 very quick questions. Yeah, gentleman there, lady there, and I'll take the lady at the back.
Hi, Madam Lagarde, David Lauder with Reuters News Service. I just wanted to return very briefly to Greece. As you well know, a lack of fiscal transparency led to this crisis originally. I'm just wondering if you can sort of discuss where Greece is in its transparency efforts. And also, were transparency issues a factor in the differing views among IMF board members about Greece's ability to meet the more ambitious fiscal targets that European lenders would like to see, the 3.5% of GDP? If not, what do you count those differences to? Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Madame Lagarde, my name is Liliana. I'm from Moldova. You just quoted Stendhal. I will start quoting Eleanor Roosevelt, talking about you, I think, who said that a woman, you never know how strong is a woman. She's like a bag of tea. You never know how strong is she until she will get into hot water. Thank you for being an interesting bag of tea. So concerning the corruption and what you mentioned, that it's more to be done in relation to corruption because it's leading to a very risky and dangerous activity, I will keep your attention a little bit more on my part of the world, on Moldova. Do you think that IMF can have the same approach towards Moldova as towards Ukraine? And are you in favor of a regional approach on anti-corruption activity, which IMF will do? I'm talking here not only about Southeastern Europe, but also about some regions. Or you will get more into individual and particular activities, also taking consideration that you mentioned the conference, lessons learned, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Right there.
Madame Lagarde, thank you so much. My name is Anjali Shahani, and I'm a student at Georgetown. And I wanted to ask about what the IMF is currently doing to ensure long-term continuity of the changes in the policies that are a result of your advisory in anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. In particular, what do you do to ensure that a new administration comes and changes whatever you have done, and that the results are long-term effect? Yeah. Thank you.
David, where is David? Somewhere over there. Yeah. So, lack of fiscal transparency clearly was one of the factors that led to Greece finding itself in the difficult spot that it found itself in 2010. I remind you that, for those who are not familiar with the Greek fiscal reporting history, that fiscal deficit grew significantly, one report after the other, and from an average of 6%, if I recall, it went up to 13% and more. So there were issues of reporting. That was acknowledged by, I think, Eurostat, and numbers were revised. I think a lot has been improved. I'm not sure that it's entirely, the job is entirely completed. We are still seeing revision and frequent revisions of some of those numbers. Everybody revised, let's face it. Including in the United States, there is often revisions of growth, 1 quarter, 2 quarters, sometimes 2 or 3 years down the road. The same is true in the euro area, but it's a fact that Greece revises quite often and in significant, with significant variations. Is that leading some of the euro area partners to expect higher or lower primary surplus? I'm not sure that this is what is dictating that view. I think it has more to do with an assessment of the potential for reforms and potential for actual economic output from those reforms. Moldova. Thank you for the quote of the tea bag. I could never tell whether it was President Roosevelt or Mrs. Roosevelt who actually said that. But that tells a lot about both of them, actually, and the relationship eventually. Your country has gone through a lot of corruption, a lot of turmoil as a result of the banking sector, essentially, and certain banks being at the center of corruption practices. So we have called, as part of the normal review that we do, we have called for a more sanitized sector, better rules being implemented, and so on and so forth. And we will continue to do that. If you know, I would have to check with the team, but if conferences on those topics were to be helpful, we would certainly we could certainly consider organizing it. That's. But thank you for flagging that. I'll talk to the team to see whether they see value in it. Long-term impact. You know, as I said, it's a forever question that we have, and we were discussing that this morning with the team. We currently have 38 missions somewhere in the world working on anti-money laundering, working on countering the financing, the terrorism financing. What is the outcome? What is the result? How efficient is it? How much less money laundering is there? How much less financing of terrorism results from those efforts? Incredibly difficult to measure. But what we can certainly notice is when eventually the legislative framework that is available and that eventually has been improved as a result of those missions is eventually disrupted, changed, removed by new authorities. And then we can raise our voice and argue that this is not helpful and it is dangerous because it finances, you know, very often illicit transfers and illegal activities and terrorism at the end of the day.
Look, we're out of time. One very quick final question, big picture question from me, again back to the context and the difficulty of the context. Is your organization agile enough, adaptable enough, do you think, now, and how much more improvement do you need to see to really reach that next milestone when we talk about transparency, when we talk about openness, and we talk about economic resilience?
Yes.
It is.
That was quick.
It is now, is
yes.
it? Madame Lagarde, thank you very much indeed. If